Welcome to this edition of Countdown to Decision 2024. I'm joined by Joseph Backholm and Paul Coleman today as we discuss how we as Christians should be looking at the issue of free speech ahead of November.
You know, Alison, and it's good to be with you once again as we consider all these issues. But you're right, in the lost sometimes in the conversation about immigration and the economy, which are, of course, super important issues to a lot of families and really practical and kind of issues of urgency in many cases. We lose sight of some of the bigger foundational issues that are at stake in this and every election. And to help us understand today the choice that we as Americans are making, the future that could be if we make the wrong choice in our upcoming elections, is Paul Coleman. He's an international human rights lawyer. He's also the executive director of ADF International, and they, of course, are great friends to all of us who care about religious freedom. Paul, welcome to Countdown to Decision 2024.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Paul, we know that Europe is different than the United States. There's similarities. Of course, we have common roots in the West, but the legal landscape for things like the free expression of religion, free exercise of religion, and free speech are different. And so if you would, because that's where you're based, and these are the things that you work on, what is the current landscape? Tell us about the issues that are related to what we would describe as First Amendment issues, but the free exercise of religion and the freedom of speech in Europe right now.
So the legal landscape, in theory, in writing, is good. So we have international human rights treaties that all the countries in Europe have signed on to. These treaties protect freedom of speech and freedom of religion using broadly similar language that you see in the First Amendment in the US. And then each country that has a constitution has constitutional protections for freedom of speech and freedom of religion. What we have seen in the last couple of decades essentially is a consistent watering down of these protections that we see in writing and essentially carve-outs within these protections say, yes, you have freedom of speech, but not if you say this or that, or you have freedom of religion, but you don't necessarily have freedom to practice it publicly and so forth. And so it's a very difficult situation because as a lawyer, I can look at the law and think, okay, we're in good shape here. These give us the protections that we need. But then in reality, we see something very different.
And what is the justification most often used, Paul, to censor these things like free speech, to control speech? What's the justification there?
We have a lot of speech restrictions in Europe, and so I won't bore your audience's time listing all of the different types. But what I would say over the last few years is the two big categories of speech restriction that we've seen rise up, and certainly the biggest pretexts for restricting speech in the last few years is under the guise of hate speech, so to speak, and punishing, penalizing, and preventing hate speech. And then more recently, this nebulous term of banning or stopping misinformation or disinformation, or as it was colloquially called a few years ago, fake news. And so these are kind of like the two main categories that we see, and we see it over and over again with legislation being passed to counter hate speech, legislation being passed to counter misinformation, and then increasingly not just legislation that we can as citizens look at and vote on and understand and what have you, whether we like it or not, but we see a lot of these speech restrictions coming in essentially behind closed doors through agreements that are being made between bureaucrats and big tech and so forth that will one day announce a new policy on banning hate speech or misinformation that no one spoke into, no one saw, but all of a sudden is regulating speech, particularly in the digital space. And I would say really since around about 2015-16, we've seen a very steady rise in speech restrictions, both in terms of banning hate speech and misinformation.
Now, Paul, you talk about that as if it's a bad thing, but we're Christians, and so we don't like lies, right? So we don't want misinformation, and we are people of love, of course, and so we don't want hate speech to take place. So why should we not support efforts to suppress lies and suppress hate?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I completely agree with you. In the speech that I give, that I make online or in person, I neither want to be hateful nor lying. But this is kind of the bait and switch, really, with these laws, because everyone agrees with that. Everyone agrees. Hey, we don't want hate speech. We don't want misinformation. But the switch occurs in terms of, okay, but who defines these terms, and can they even be defined? So, for example, if we take hate speech, for example, and everyone says, yeah, we shouldn't hate people. This is a term that is exceptionally difficult to define. And if people look up what is the international legal definition of hate speech, they will immediately see Google results that say there is no internationally agreed definition of hate speech. I don't think it can be adequately defined, and certainly not in law, because what one person says is hate speech, another person says it's not. It's my opinion. And to give one example, I am working on the case of a member of parliament in Finland called Päivi Räsänen. She's a very long-standing member of parliament, in office almost 30 years. She's currently being prosecuted for hate speech for tweeting a picture of some Bible verses. And the prosecutor and the police in Finland call this hate speech. She says it's not. It's love speech. Well, who decides that? Who gets to decide? It's always those in power. And that's the problem with these terms. If you put into law speech restrictions that are overly broad, vaguely worded, then it's those in power who define what they mean. And what we're seeing consistently across Europe and around the West is that these are being applied in such a way that actually targets Christian speech.
And thank goodness for ADF International to come alongside her and defend her. Paul, share more stories. Give me more examples of what your clients are facing in terms of persecution and censorship from the government. I've talked to my neighbors here, and when I tried to explain to them what was happening across the pond in terms of getting, thrown in jail or arrested for praying in your head, they thought I was crazy. They hadn't heard about it. Can you walk us through what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, the cases you're referring to in the UK, a number of local laws have been passed and now national legislation that bans certain speech in the vicinity of abortion facilities. So we call these buffer zones or censorship zones. And so in the UK, a number of pro-life advocates have been arrested by the police for simply standing in public spaces and not even saying anything, for praying silently. We've got video footage of police asking people, what are you praying about in your head? Someone was arrested for holding a sign saying, praying for freedom of speech. And so these are stories and laws that people, they can't believe it's real and it's happening, but it is. And in fact, in the case of Isabel Vaughan Spruce, who's a well-known pro-life leader in the UK, she's been arrested a number of times by the police. She was searched, she was taken to the station, she was asked, what are you praying about? And we helped her take an action against the police for wrongful arrest. And the police recently paid her several £1,000s in compensation, essentially admitting that they had made a mistake in doing that. And so we can, in these instances, push back against it. But it also highlights, I think, just how extreme things have gone. We also have cases, for example, just south of the US in Mexico, a couple of Mexican public members of public office, one current congressman, a former congressman. They are both facing investigation because in Mexico, the Congress has a certain number of seats allocated towards women to encourage a certain diversity within the Congress. Seats started to be taken by biological men identifying as women, and these public figures spoke out against that, and now they are being investigated for calling this out and facing all sorts of censorship and reprisals in Mexico. And we see similar cases across the Western world. And a lot of the speech, it is, of course, free speech is for everyone. It's something that Christians should be paying particular attention to, because in the examples I've just given, Päivi Räsänen is facing criminal prosecution for speaking out about marriage. Isabel Vaughan Spruce is being arrested by the police for speaking out about unborn life. And then in Mexico, Gabriel Cuadri and Rodrigo Cortez, these two Mexican congressmen, they are being investigated for speaking out about biological reality, that we were made male and female. All of these issues deeply important, of course, to Christians. Those in power have always sought to restrict, control, censor speech. So that is not a new thing in human history. The question is whether they can get away with it or not. And what we've seen happen in Europe and across the West is that essentially those in power have been able to restrict increasingly speech of its citizens. They have got away with it, and censorship begets more censorship. Once you start that process, there's not really a logical stopping point that those in power say, do you know what, I think we've censored enough speech now, no more. No, what we see is once you go down that path, it just leads to more and more censorship. If we could just censor a little bit more speech, then we'll have this perfect utopian society. And of course we see it doesn't work that way.
What's the difference between the legal environment in the United States and the legal environment in Europe that is seeing significantly different outcomes in many cases when it comes to free speech and free exercise cases?
I think that's a critical point. Go back 100 years, and the way that, for example, the UK saw and interpreted free speech would have been much more similar to the US. And what's happened over the last number of decades is these countries, and we could generalize from the UK to the rest of the Western world essentially, and then compare that to the US. There's been a fork in the road. They've gone in different directions. And that has largely come through the judicial interpretation of the First Amendment in the US versus the judicial interpretation of our analogous free speech protections in other parts of the world. Now, what that means, that's good for America, and long may that continue. What it also means is I think that the US is more vulnerable to this sort of censorship taking hold than people might realize. Because a lot of people that I meet in the US, and they will say, thank God we have the First Amendment. But it's not that is something particularly special. It's the way that it has been interpreted to protect speech over a number of years that is what counts. And I think that I ask, well, what would it take for that to change? If the culture within America was calling for more censorship, which in many places it is, if you have some of the biggest companies that have ever existed, for example, the big tech industry, largely in favor of censorship, if you have your college campuses leading and training the leaders of tomorrow, largely in favor of censorship, and then if you have increasing political voices also in that direction, then what would it take for a number of justices on the Supreme Court to change over time or what have you, and all of a sudden you could find yourself in a similar situation?
Wow. I think that's a powerful reminder to those who think we are protected from this sort of attack from the government in terms of your ability to simply speak freely, pray freely. These are issues that matter deeply to Christians. And obviously we care about what's happening over there because we are all brothers and sisters in Christ. But Paul, bring it back here. For us as Americans heading into November and looking at what we have as options, will America follow? Is it inevitable that we'll follow the same path? Do we have time to course correct? And what would that look like for us?
I definitely think it's not inevitable that the US will follow. But I think it's closer culturally towards a drive towards the sort of censorship we're seeing in Europe than I think many Americans would like to believe. And this is based on my experience working in this area for many years, and many conversations, many trips to the US. My perception is that with my American friends that I speak to, they feel confident in the protection that the First Amendment provides, and good for them. But meanwhile, the wagons are circling around the First Amendment, calling for more and more censorship. And I think the warning is we're seeing this in a lot of indirect ways, which is often hard to identify and hard to challenge. We're seeing it through, for example, the pressure that governments place on the digital public square to do content moderation, which is a form of censorship. And there's more and more evidence that governments around the world are putting pressure on these companies to censor speech on their platforms. We see it in a lot of different places, like I mentioned, in terms of through private companies, through US college campuses and so forth. And then we've also seen, even in the last few days, leading political figures talk openly about supporting censorship and potentially do we need to amend the First Amendment? And so I think that it's definitely closer than I think a lot of people realize. It's not inevitable that the US will go there, but if the US is to avoid this path of censorship that the rest of the West has gone down, then it needs to reclaim a culture of free speech, which it's had for so many decades.
You know, Paul, to illustrate your point there, an article in the New York Times dated August 31st, so not that long ago, it said, the title is, "The Constitution is Sacred. Is it also dangerous?" And one of the biggest threats to America's politics might be the country's founding documents. So are we really looking at a situation where the difference between the U.S. today and Europe when it comes to free exercise, free speech issues is simply a Supreme Court that says you have the right to say things that are offensive, and courts that say you don't have the right to say things that are offensive?
Well, so the day before that opinion piece was written, the Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alexander de Moraes issued an order suspending the operation of X in the country of Brazil. Why? Because he had called for the suspension, censorship of certain popular accounts on X, including political figures of the opposition of the president, including many other public figures. X had refused to do that. And so a number of threats were made towards the company, including potentially arresting people who work for the company. So X was forced to close down its operations in Brazil. And then at the very end of August, it was shut down completely by a single sitting Supreme Court justice. And so to answer the question, yes, that's basically the difference there. And you can see it perfectly illustrated with one country, one day, one Supreme Court deciding to shut down one of the largest free speech platforms in the world. And then compare that to, well, what will our own equivalent of that be in our own countries? And that's why it's closer than we think, because on the Brazil point, it's not Iran, it's not North Korea, it's not China. It's one of the largest countries, most populous countries in the world. It's one of the largest economies in the world. It's considered part of the Western democratic order. And yet here it is taking an action like that from the Supreme Court. And so it's the rise of global censorship is on our doorstep, and it is a warning to you in America and to everyone else who hasn't gone quite as far as Brazil.
Yeah, and I think that matters for those of us who are considering who we're going to vote for in these various elections, to realize that the current makeup of the United States Supreme Court is really, in many ways, the last stand that we have against this kind of European leftist view of the free exercise of religion, the freedom of speech that has, the potential to just ban platforms that say things that the government doesn't like and send politicians into prison for tweeting pictures of the Bible.
Yeah, it's a great point. And what we have to think about as Christians is the issues that matter most to us, that are gospel-oriented issues, are under attack. And right now we have the freedom to do this interview and talk openly about them. And Paul, I hope you're in a secure location. But you're saying that is under potential that we wouldn't be able to continue to have free speech. We couldn't go to our local abortion facility and simply pray. I couldn't tweet a Bible verse if it implies how I feel about marriage. That's huge. And I want to make sure everyone hears that we shouldn't become so comfortable with the liberties that have been fought for that we stop defending them. We have to ensure that they are defended. So, Paul, are there people rising up and opposing what's going on? What is happening? I know ADF International and your colleagues are opposing what's going on, but are people waking up to realizing the danger of this, or they just think it's okay or agreeing with it?
I think it's been the classic slowly boiled frog. And so, and this is the thing with censorship, is that it begets more censorship. And so as it begins, I have experienced a lot of people who are relatively okay with it on the basis that it's portrayed as targeting the bad guys. It's not going to affect me. I'm a nice Christian or what have you, it's not a problem. And then finding that it's getting closer and closer to their doorstep. But by which point, we're talking now about hundreds of pieces of legislation. We're talking about countless regulations that are so hard to untangle at this point, compacts with all the big tech firms and so forth. We're talking about an AI-powered technology that is able to essentially delete mass amounts of content online. All of that infrastructure, both legislatively and technologically, has been built in the last decade or so, while the majority of people have not considered this to be a particularly big deal. And I think the reason for that is because they have bought the bait and switch that it's not too bad to ban hate speech because I would never do it, without realizing that what they're doing actually is supporting something that is so vaguely worded, that is so broad in its nature, that it could absolutely come back to target them further down the line.
Paul, I think it was Winston Churchill who said some version of an appeaser is one who feeds a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. And, it's this idea that, it's affecting other people. It's the baker, the florist, it's the, the nurse, whoever it is. It's the, right-wing politician, whatever, because that's not me. Is the antidote to this in the U.S. or anywhere in the globe really a population that stands up and says, you can't censor, you can't punish anyone, and by virtue of protecting others, even if it's not ourselves, that's how we protect ourselves?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that generating that culture of free speech will solve your Supreme Court challenge of who sits on the court, because we want to be creating a culture in which it shouldn't matter ultimately if it's what 5 people in the entire country you have in that seat. You should be in a position where there's such a culture of free speech that it would be unthinkable, some of the things that we've been talking about here. I think that we as Christians should be playing a leading role in that, because I think that we should deeply care about this issue. I think that Christians in the past have cared often about it when thinking about their own speech, but I think that's tactically a mistake, because to do this properly, we're really talking about not only the speech that we want to say, but also the speech with which we disagree. I think that's an important point. And I think we need to be working with people whom we do disagree with on certain issues, but can come alongside and form broad consensus and alliances on this issue, and say, we might disagree on some of the moral issues of the day, and we will, but let's join together in defending the freedom to debate those issues properly.
I've heard even within the church the sentiment that, well, if I defend my rights, that's essentially selfishness. That's thinking about me, and Christians don't do that. As the idea that, laying down my rights, surrendering my rights, refusing to defend my rights is actually an act of selflessness.
I think we have a great biblical example with the Apostle Paul, who used his rights as a Roman citizen in order to proclaim the gospel. And it's very clear, he knew his rights, and he was prepared to stand up for them in order, not for his own sake. He wasn't someone who was bothered, in a sense, about the sufferings that he was facing, but he did so in order to proclaim the gospel. I think in terms of, in our day, using the rights that we have and standing up for them, what that means is we are defending freedom, not just for ourselves, but for everyone else who will benefit as a result. And so to go back to the start and the case of Päivi Räsänen, her case is now at the Supreme Court of Finland. We won at the appellate court, we won at the district court. If we win and she is acquitted, at the Supreme Court of Finland, that will be great for her. It will be great for her family. It will be great for her church. But it will also be great for everyone else in Finland, even if they vehemently disagree with her, who will benefit from the precedent that that sets, that maybe they will need to rely on one day.
Paul, thank you so much for walking us through this. Can you just give us a practical way for our listeners to apply, the fight for free speech in their daily interactions?
I think that firstly, we should use the speech that we have. And so we should not be self-censoring out of fear. And so I think the first point is always you have the freedom, so use the speech that you have. Secondly, practical point, I think we need to be prepared to be offended. I think we need to model that. I don't think often necessarily we've always done a good job of that. And I think that it's important because you see this across the political spectrum. You see this sensitivity and this offense being taken on the left and on the right. And I think that we have to, if we're going to engage in free speech discourse, then there'll be things that we hear that offend us, and we have to be okay with that. We have to build bridges and build consensus across party lines. I think that can be done, and I think that it's something that we can do, at a policy level and national level. We can also do in our own circles as well. And then I think we need to be listening to what our politicians are saying and our leaders are saying and be on the lookout for those who are calling for censorship. We need to be thinking very carefully about what that will mean. And I think that the biggest warning I could give from Europe is censorship. When politicians are promoting censorship, they're always doing it in the broadest terms that you would think, well, who would disagree with that? It sounds reasonable. But then the real question to ask is, well, how are you defining these things that you want to censor? And very often, that one question of how are these things being defined will unravel the whole thing. And then secondly, and who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what is not allowed? And so I think using that lens, using that as a lens to analyze the speech of those in power and politicians as they're talking about speech restrictions, I think can be very helpful. And I think that we should be extremely cautious about welcoming those into power who support government-enforced censorship.
That's a great, I think, place to end this conversation on censorship, free speech. Paul, thank you for walking us through what's going on in your neighborhood so that we can best defend our right here in America. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, Joseph. Again, I look forward to our continued conversations. We've got a great lineup, friends, for the next few weeks as we get into November. Just leaders that are doing the right thing, that are defending our rights, that are speaking truth to power and guiding us on how to do it. So don't miss another episode of Countdown to Decision 2024, a project of the James Dobson Family Institute. We will see you next time.